The sun was shining bright on Christmas Day, but it felt cold inside me. My son-in-law, Trevor, looked at me with a smirk. "You're just a silly old man," he said loudly, laughing like I was a joke. He was talking about history, saying I didn't know anything. Everyone in the room got quiet. You could hear a pin drop. Then, a man I didn't know, a guest, suddenly looked at me with wide eyes. "Professor?" he said, like he'd seen a ghost. He rushed over and shook my hand firmly. Trevor's smug smile fell apart. His whole world seemed to crash around him right there. "Hey, old man." Trevor's voice was sharp like a knife. "I know Gettysburg was in '64. He sounded so sure of himself. I slowly put my coffee cup down. It made a soft clink against the wooden table. My old leather chair creaked as I sat up straighter. 40 years of being a professor kept my hands from shaking, even though my heart was beating a little fast. "Actually, Trevor," I said, my voice calm and steady, like I was in a classroom. "It was July 1st through 3rd, 1863. Trevor's face turned bright red. He hit his hand on my fireplace mantel, and the family pictures jumped. "Enough," he yelled. "You're just an old fool who gets everything mixed up." The fire crackled in the sudden quiet. Emily, my daughter, sat between us on the sofa, twisting her hands. "Trevor, please," she said softly. "I've studied this for 40 years, I said, my voice quiet, gripping my coffee mug. It felt fragile in my hands like everything else in that moment. "Yeah?" Trevor spun around, his fancy shoes squeaking on my wood floor. "Well, maybe it's time you stopped. That show I watched on TV clearly said '64. You're losing your mind, Martin." Emily stood up fast. "That's enough." Her voice was sharp, just like when she was a teenager. "Dad knows what he's talking about." "Oh, great." Trevor threw his hands up. "Now you're picking his side against your own husband." "I'm not picking sides," Emily said, her voice firm. "I'm just saying what's true. Dad taught about the Civil War for many years." She walked quickly towards the closet, looking angry. Trevor laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. "Taught? Used to teach, Emily. For a reason." His words felt like punches. I watched him grab his black coat. He looked so angry, like he was completely right. Emily followed him, her face pale but strong. "Trevor, we're leaving," she said, not looking at me. "Good." He pulled on his coat quickly. "I don't need to sit here and listen to crazy talk from someone who doesn't know simple history." Emily finally looked at me. Her green eyes, just like my late wife's, held both sadness and anger. "Dad, It's fine, sweetheart." I lied easily, my lifelong habit of protecting her kicking in. "Drive safely." Trevor was already at the front door. "Come on, Em. Let's go somewhere with people who live in the real world." Emily paused for a second, then followed him out. The door closed softly, and the sound echoed in my suddenly empty house. I stayed in my chair, listening to Trevor's fancy car start up in my driveway. Through the window, I watched their headlights sweep across the snow on my lawn as they backed out. The red taillights disappeared down the street, leaving me alone with the dying fire and the word "fool" still ringing in my ears. Slowly, my knees creaking, I walked to the window. The street looked peaceful under the Christmas snow. Other houses glowed with warm lights, showing normal families having normal dinners. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and watched until their taillights vanished completely into the dark night. The front door closed, making a sound that felt like it settled deep in my bones. I stood there for a moment, my hand still on the doorknob, listening to the silence that filled my house like water filling a sinking boat. Fool. The word bounced around in my mind. 40 years of teaching, and this young man tells me I don't know simple facts. I walked slowly back to my library, past the family photos that had seen everything. Emily's wedding picture smiled from the mantelpiece, her bright face next to Trevor's confident grin. How different that grin looked tonight, twisted with meanness and certainty. My library walls stretched out before me, filled with hundreds of books, arranged perfectly, just as they had been for decades. I knew exactly where to find what I needed. My fingers traced along the worn spines until they found the familiar dark red leather. Encyclopedia of American History, Volume 7. The book opened in my hands like an old friend. I'd used these pages countless times, teaching young people about America's bloodiest war. The part about Gettysburg appeared easily under my fingers. The Battle of Gettysburg, I read aloud to my empty library, July 1st through 3rd, 1863. I placed the book on my reading table and grabbed my notepad, a habit from years of preparing lectures. My special pen scratched across the paper. Gettysburg, July 1st to 3rd, 1863, Union victory, turning point of Civil War. The words stared back at me, neat and clear. I knew them by heart, had said them to thousands of students over 40 years. Each fact was carved into my memory like names on a monument. I pulled down another book, then another. The Civil War Encyclopedia, Battles and Leaders, Military History of the United States. Every single book confirmed what I knew was true. The smell of old books filled the air, leather covers, old paper, the faint, dusty smell of so much knowledge. This library was my life's work, my passion, my greatest comfort after Margaret, my wife, had died. These books were my link to the world of ideas that always made me feel alive. 4 decades of teaching Civil War history, guiding young minds through the hardest parts of America's war, and my own son-in-law called me a confused old man. I looked up at my diplomas on the wall. Bachelor's from Oregon State, Master's from University of Washington, PhD from Stanford, 40 years at Portland Community College, 3 papers published on Civil War tactics, students who still sent me Christmas cards, thanking me for making them love history. All of it meant nothing to Trevor, it seemed. I looked at the family photo on my desk. Emily at her high school graduation, proud in her cap and gown. She had always been smart, curious, asking questions that made me think harder. When had she stopped caring about real knowledge? When had she chosen to avoid conflict instead of speaking the truth? The encyclopedia was still open. I traced the words with my finger, each word a small victory. But a victory for whom? The empty house had no one to hear my truth. Closing the book gently, I looked at the family photo again. Emily's young face looked back at me full of hope. That girl would have corrected Trevor right away, would have stood up for facts. What had happened to her? I put the encyclopedia back exactly where it belonged. The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire, unanswered and troubling. 5 days until Christmas. 5 days to decide what kind of man I wanted to be. The week crawled by. I worked in my winter garden, read many books, and kept thinking about that evening. Every morning was the same. Coffee, newspaper, the quiet rhythm of a retired man's life. But deep down, something had changed. The word fool had dug deep, making an ache that wouldn't go away. Friday morning was gray and cold. I stood at my kitchen window, watching snow dust the bare branches of my oak tree, when the phone rang. Dad. Emily's voice was too cheerful, that forced happiness I knew she used to make things seem okay. Hello, sweetheart, I said, putting down my coffee cup and listening closely. I wanted to call about Christmas. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Will you come to dinner with us? We're having a few people over, Trevor's parents, some neighbors, a couple of his co-workers. The invitation surprised me. After Sunday's fight, I thought Christmas would be small and uncomfortable. Of course. Does Trevor mind? Another pause. Everything will be fine, Dad. I promise. I walked to the kitchen window, the phone to my ear, and looked at my snowy garden. The careful way Emily spoke told me everything. Trevor didn't know about this, or if he did, he wasn't happy. What time should I arrive? Around 6. It's just family and friends. Nothing fancy. Her relief was clear now that I'd said yes. I'm making that roast you love. Sounds wonderful. I grabbed the calendar on my fridge, marking December 25th with my pen. The date looked lonely on the mostly empty month. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, Dad. That's enough. As I listened to my daughter's careful invitation, I realized this Christmas gathering might be the perfect chance to fix the coldness that had settled between us like winter frost. The mention of co-workers sparked something in my memory. Trevor worked at Morrison & Associates, a very important consulting company. Interesting. Emily, I said gently, about Sunday. It's forgotten, Dad. Old news. The words came out too quickly, too brightly. I'll see you Christmas Day, okay? Okay, old news, I repeated after she hung up. The words stayed in my mind as I went back to my coffee and newspaper. Old news. Exactly what Trevor claimed I knew nothing about. I folded the paper to the local news, scanning the familiar pages. Obituaries, community events, business news. My eyes stopped on a small article. Morrison Associates celebrates successful year. It talked about the company's growth, their new clients, their great reputation, Trevor's workplace. Trevor's co-workers would be at Christmas dinner. I put the paper aside and looked at my calendar again. December 25th circled in blue ink. 5 days to get ready, 5 days to think about what kind of Christmas gift a father might give his son-in-law. The morning light shifted through my window, making long shadows on the kitchen floor. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything in clean white, like a fresh start. I smiled for the first time since Sunday. The weekend passed quietly. I read, worked in my garden, and found myself thinking about Christmas dinner more than usual. By Tuesday morning, Christmas Eve had arrived with that special feeling that important days bring. Today felt different. I stood at my bedroom window, watching snow fall past the bare oak branches, and made my decision. If I was going to face Trevor's disrespect again, I would do it right. The navy blue suit hanging in my closet, the one I'd worn to Stockholm when Professor Anderson won the Nobel Prize in History, seemed right for the occasion. Getting dressed had always been a ritual for me. 40 years of giving lectures had taught me that how you look matters, that respect often starts with how you present yourself. I carefully trimmed my beard, shined my black leather shoes until they gleamed, and adjusted my tie with the precision of someone getting ready for a big speech. The kitchen table became my workspace. Brown paper was spread across it, gold ribbon curled beside scissors, and Emily's gift waited to be wrapped. I had chosen carefully a book about Eleanor Roosevelt that she had mentioned wanting months ago. She probably thought I'd forgotten, but professors never forget what their students are interested in. The wine was harder to pick. I had spent an hour at Morrison's market yesterday, reading labels and asking questions. I finally chose a red wine from a vineyard Margaret and I had visited on our anniversary trip to France. Not so expensive that it looked showy, but good enough to show I knew quality. My hands moved steadily, wrapping the gifts, creasing the edges with academic care. Each fold had to be perfect, each corner sharp. The book disappeared under elegant brown paper, looking worthy of the special day. The morning newspaper lay folded beside my coffee cup. Headlines announced Christmas Eve events in Portland, church services, charity drives, family gatherings, normal people doing normal things. I wondered how many of them were getting ready to walk into situations where their basic abilities would be questioned. Church bells chimed in the distance, St. Mary's marking 9 o'clock. I had 9 hours until Emily expected me. 9 hours to keep the calm I had built up since Friday's phone call. Standing before my hallway mirror, I adjusted my tie one last time. The reflection looked back with steady gray eyes. A man who had spent 40 years teaching young minds to think, to question, to value facts over opinions. That man deserved respect, no matter what Trevor Collins believed about confused old fools. My coat hung ready by the front door, leather gloves tucked in the pockets, car keys on the small table where I'd put them the night before. Everything ready, everything in its place. As I gathered my gifts and walked towards the garage, I wondered if this Christmas Eve would start a new chapter in our family's story, or just add another layer to an already complicated relationship. The question hung in the winter air like my visible breath, unanswered but somehow hopeful. The engine started smoothly, warming in the December cold, while I arranged Emily's wrapped gift and the wine bottle on the passenger seat. 20 minutes across Portland to their house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood. 20 minutes to get ready for whatever the evening might bring. I backed out of my driveway and turned towards Emily Street, leaving my quiet house behind. The drive through Portland's holiday-lit neighborhoods gave me time to see and prepare. Emily Street sparkled with Christmas decorations. Each house tried to be brighter than its neighbors with lights and lawn displays. Their driveway already held 4 other cars: a fancy car, another fancy car, an ordinary car, and a practical car that probably belonged to neighbors. I parked behind the ordinary car and gathered my gifts from the passenger seat. Through the large front windows, I could see people moving, hear the distant sound of talking and laughter. A successful Christmas Eve party was already in full swing. The doorbell's chime brought Emily to the door right away, as if she had been watching for me. Her smile seemed real, but it had that nervous energy I knew well. "Dad, you look so handsome." She kissed my cheek, then stepped back to admire my navy suit. "Very professorial. Thank you, sweetheart." I handed her the wrapped book. "Something I thought you might enjoy." Following her inside, I carried the wine and looked at the scene before me. Their living room had been turned into a holiday show. A 10-foot tree covered in white lights, garlands around the fireplace, red and gold decorations making the cream-colored walls feel warm. 8 or 9 guests were gathered in groups, talking comfortably, their wine glasses catching the flickering firelight. Then Trevor's voice cut through the soft chatter like a knife through silk. "Oh ho ho, and here's our confused old man, the one who mixes up his dates." Every conversation stopped. All eyes turned towards me as I stood in the doorway, still holding the bottle of wine. The laughter that followed Trevor's introduction spread through the room like ripples in water. Each guest wasn't sure if it was a loving family joke or something meaner. Trevor stood near the fireplace, clearly the star of the evening, surrounded by 3 younger couples who had been hanging on his every word. His confident grin suggested he'd been telling them family stories, building up to this moment of my arrival. "Everyone meet Martin, Emily's father," he continued, gesturing towards me dramatically. "He thinks Gettysburg happened in 1863. Can you believe that?" More laughter, though some guests looked uncomfortable with this public teasing. I kept my calm, using 40 years of classroom experience. "Lovely to see everyone here," I said calmly, placing the wine on Emily's side table. Emily quickly moved to my side. "Dad, let me introduce you to the Hendersons from next door. And these are Trevor's colleagues from Morrison." No, Em," Trevor interrupted, clearly enjoying his audience. "Let me tell them about Sunday's argument first. This is educational." An older gentleman near the bookshelf looked up from examining Emily's collection. His expression became thoughtful as he studied my face. Something about his academic manner suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with Trevor's show either. "The History Channel documentary was crystal clear," Trevor continued, getting more into his story. "Gettysburg, 1864. But Professor Emeritus here insists on living in the past with outdated information." The guests' laughter felt more forced now, just being polite instead of genuinely amused. Emily's face had gone pale, her hands clenched into small fists at her sides. I accepted a glass of wine from someone's offered tray and smiled politely at everyone. "Thank you for including me in your celebration." But my eyes had found the distinguished gentleman by the bookshelf, who was now watching me with growing recognition in his intelligent eyes. 15 minutes of polite conversation had passed since Trevor's introduction, and I'd managed to get through the social difficulties with practiced academic grace. The Hendersons were delightful neighbors, full of stories about their recent trip to Scotland. Trevor's co-workers from Morrison seemed intelligent enough, though they clearly went along with their host's stories about family issues. I moved towards Emily's bookshelf, seeking a moment of peace in the familiar comfort of looking at someone else's books. Her collection showed careful thought: history books next to modern novels, philosophy books next to travel guides. My daughter had good taste in books, at least. "Professor Banks." The voice was so enthusiastic that I turned immediately, my wine glass halfway to my lips. A distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes approached with the confident walk of someone used to academic settings. "I'm sorry, do we?" I began, though something about how he carried himself felt familiar. "Henry Wilson. We worked together at Yale." His face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I taught economics while you were revolutionizing the history department." Recognition dawned like a sunrise. "Henry, my goodness, it's been at least 15 years since the faculty retreat in Vermont." He clasped my hand warmly. "You look exactly the same, though I suspect you're enjoying retirement more than those endless committee meetings." Our conversation started to draw subtle attention from nearby guests. The Hendersons paused their own discussion to listen. Even one of Trevor's coworkers glanced our way, curiosity clear in her expression. "Yale, was it?" Mrs. Henderson asked politely. "How wonderful that you two found each other again." Henry's excitement bubbled over. "Found each other, Margaret?" This man was a legend on campus. Students would camp outside his office during registration, hoping to get into his Civil War seminars. My cheeks felt warm at the praise, though I noticed Emily watching nervously from across the room. She had positioned herself where she could watch both our conversation and Trevor's ongoing performance near the fireplace. "Henry exaggerates," I said modestly. "I simply tried to make history relevant to young minds." "Relevant?" Henry laughed, turning to address our growing audience. This modest man published the definitive analysis of Gettysburg strategy that's still cited in military academies worldwide. The word Gettysburg seemed to echo through the room like a bell. Conversation near the fireplace stopped slightly, as Trevor's sharp ears caught the reference. His storytelling voice grew louder, trying to get attention. Henry continued, unaware of the family drama he was walking into. "I remember that faculty dinner when Harvard tried to steal you away. The entire history department practically formed a human chain around your office." More guests had begun to move towards our corner of the room, drawn by Henry's lively stories. The bookshelf was a natural gathering point, and my old colleagues' tales were proving more interesting than appetizers and small talk. "What was your specialty exactly, Professor Banks?" asked one of Trevor's colleagues, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s. Before I could answer, Henry jumped in with professional pride. "Civil War history, particularly battle tactics and political implications. Martin could recite troop movements at Gettysburg from memory, down to the hour." Trevor's voice from across the room grew more insistent, but I noticed several of his audience members glancing our way with clear interest. The social flow of the evening was shifting in ways none of us had expected. Emily appeared at my elbow with suspicious timing, carrying a fresh bottle of wine. "Dad, would you help me in the kitchen for a moment?" But Henry was just getting started, and our growing audience seemed genuinely curious about these unexpected revelations about the quiet man Trevor had introduced as confused about basic facts. Henry's excitement overflowed like wine from an overfilled glass. Our small group had grown to include the Hendersons, two of Trevor's co-workers, and several other guests who had left their conversations to listen to the academic stories. 35 years Martin taught at Yale, Henry announced to our growing audience. Brilliant lecturer. Students would camp outside his office hoping for a spot in his seminars. Mrs. Henderson leaned closer, her earlier politeness replaced by true interest. "What was your field exactly, Professor Banks?" Before I could answer with my usual modesty, Henry jumped in with professorial zeal. "Civil War history primarily, but Martin's real genius was connecting historical patterns to economic theory, interdisciplinary work before it became fashionable." I noticed Emily hovering near the kitchen doorway, her face pale as she watched the conversation unfold. She had placed herself where she could watch both our group and Trevor's ongoing performance near the fireplace. His research on the economic consequences of historical events was revolutionary, Henry continued, warming to his subject. "That's what earned him the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998. The words hit the room like a clap of thunder. Complete silence fell over our corner of the living room. Even the background conversation seemed to stop, as if the very air had changed. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. The Hendersons exchanged startled glances. "Did you say Nobel Prize?" whispered one of Trevor's colleagues, a sharp-eyed woman who had introduced herself as Sarah from the firm. Henry beamed with professional pride. Indeed, the committee recognized his groundbreaking analysis of how major historical conflicts reshape economic systems. His paper on Civil War monetary policy influenced Federal Reserve practices for decades. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or triumph I couldn't tell. "Henry, you're too kind. It was collaborative work." "Nonsense." He turned to address the growing circle of listeners. This modest man revolutionized how we understand the intersection of history and economics. Harvard tried to steal him away twice. Princeton made offers that would make your head spin. The sound in the room had completely changed. Trevor's voice still carried from the fireplace, but his audience was drifting away, drawn by the strong pull of unexpected revelation. Even the Christmas music seemed quieter against Henry's enthusiastic testimony. "I remember the faculty celebration when the Nobel Committee called." Henry continued, his academic instincts fully engaged. "The entire history department gathered in the faculty lounge. We'd always known Martin was special, but international recognition, it felt like vindication for all of us." Sarah, the colleague from Morrison, stepped closer. "Professor Banks, I have to ask, do you still publish? Research current economic patterns?" "Retirement has its pleasures," I said carefully, aware that Emily was now moving through the crowd towards us, her expression a mix of relief and growing worry. Henry caught my diplomatic tone and laughed. "Still humble after all these years? Martin, you must tell them about the Smithsonian lecture series you consulted on." But his words were competing with a different sound now. Footsteps approaching from across the room, heavy, purposeful steps that carried the weight of someone whose attention had finally been caught by phrases like Nobel Prize and Professor floating above the general conversation. Trevor had noticed the unusual quiet, the way his party guests were drawn to our corner of the room. "Wait, what's all this about a Nobel Prize?" Trevor's voice cut through our gathering like a knife through birthday cake. He pushed through the small crowd with the aggressive confidence of a host taking back control of his own party. Henry turned with academic enthusiasm, clearly happy to share his colleagues' achievements with new audiences. "I was just telling everyone about Martin's distinguished career at Yale University." "Distinguished?" Trevor's laugh held no humor. "This is all nonsense. He doesn't even know basic historical facts." The room's energy shifted again, this time towards discomfort. Guests stepped back slightly, sensing family drama about to explode in their carefully polite Christmas gathering. "Trevor," Emily's voice held a warning, but her husband was beyond hearing subtle cues. "He claimed Gettysburg was in 1863, Trevor continued, his voice getting louder with his desperation. "Complete confusion. I corrected him myself just last week." Henry's expression shifted from enthusiasm to confusion. He looked between Trevor and me, trying to understand this unexpected hostility towards a respected colleague. "I'm sorry," Henry said carefully, "but Gettysburg was indeed July 1st through 3rd, 1863. That's established historical fact." "No!" Trevor's face turned red above his expensive sweater. The History Channel documentary was crystal clear. 1864. I know what I watched. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Mrs. Henderson touched her husband's arm, a subtle sign about witnessing family conflict. Sarah from Morrison looked fascinated despite herself, watching the drama unfold with professional interest in human behavior. I maintained my calm, drawing on decades of managing difficult classroom situations. "Perhaps we could simply verify this online. Most smartphones have internet access." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Trevor hesitated, his confidence flickering for the first time since his aggressive approach. Emily moved closer to her husband, her face tight with apprehension. "Fine." Trevor pulled his phone from his pocket with dramatic determination. "Let's settle this once and for all. Everyone can see how confused old academics get their facts mixed up." Henry watched this exchange with growing understanding of the family dynamics he'd innocently disrupted. His earlier enthusiasm had cooled to concerned observation. "Trevor, please," Emily whispered. But her husband was committed to his path now, phone glowing in his hands as the assembled guests waited for objective proof. The Christmas tree lights cast gentle shadows across the tense scene. Holiday decorations provided an odd backdrop for a confrontation that would either prove 40 years of scholarship or confirm Trevor's story of confused old age. "Let's see here," Trevor muttered, typing with aggressive confidence. "Battle of Gettysburg date." The room held its collective breath as technology prepared to deliver judgment on historical truth. Trevor's fingers moved across his phone screen with the confidence of a man sure he was about to prove his point to a room full of witnesses. The small device glowed in his hands like a judge's light, ready to give a verdict on historical accuracy. "Battle of Gettysburg," he announced to our gathered audience, his voice holding dramatic authority. "Let's see what actual sources say about dates." The screen loaded with modern speed. Trevor's eyes scanned the results, his confident expression slowly changing into something like confusion. "July 1st through 3rd. His voice faltered slightly as he read the search results aloud. 1863. Silence stretched through the room like sticky candy. Even the Christmas music seemed to pause, respecting the moment of truth unfolding before us. "This can't be right," Trevor muttered, his thumb frantically scrolling through multiple search results. Wikipedia, Encyclopedia Britannica, National Park Service. They all say 1863. Henry finished gently, his academic instincts engaged despite the family drama around us. But Trevor wasn't finished. His desperation had kicked into high gear, fingers flying across the phone screen with increasing speed. "Let me check something else," he announced, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "This Nobel Prize claim, Martin Banks Nobel Prize." I watched my son-in-law's face in the blue glow of his phone screen as the search results appeared. Each result seemed to drain more color from his face. 1998 Nobel Prize in Economics, he read in barely audible tones. Martin James Banks, Yale University for groundbreaking analysis of historical economic patterns. The phone trembled slightly in his hands as he kept scrolling through result after result, each one confirming Henry's enthusiastic testimony about my academic career. Reuters News Archive, Nobel Foundation official website, Yale University faculty history. His voice grew smaller with each confirmation. Emily had moved close enough to see the screen over his shoulder, her face a mixture of relief and concern for her husband's very public embarrassment. The other guests stood frozen in fascination, watching the complete collapse of their host's confident story. Sarah from Morrison leaned forward slightly, her professional curiosity clear as she watched Trevor grapple with objective evidence contradicting everything he'd believed about his father-in-law. "This is impossible," Trevor whispered, staring at the screen as if willing it to change what it showed. Henry stepped forward with gentle academic authority. "Martin never mentioned his Nobel Prize because he's genuinely modest about his achievements. It's quite characteristic of distinguished scholars." The phone screen continued to glow with undeniable proof. Photographs from the Nobel ceremony, academic articles citing my research, Yale University's faculty achievement archives, 40 years of professional accomplishment laid bare before the very people who had witnessed my introduction as a confused old man just minutes earlier. Trevor stood motionless, phone clutched in his hand as reality rebuilt itself around him in front of his Christmas Eve guests. The silence stretched like taffy, thick and uncomfortable, as Trevor stared at his phone screen. The device trembled slightly in his hands, its blue glow lighting up a face that had gone through several shades of understanding. "Okay, fine." He looked up from the damning evidence, his voice holding the desperate edge of a cornered animal. "Maybe you got the dates right about some old battle." I watched him try to grasp at any remaining shred of superiority, his eyes darting around the room for support that was no longer there. "But you never actually received that prize, did you?" Trevor's voice grew louder, more confident, as if he'd found his escape. "I mean, you didn't go to Stockholm or anything. You're just making that up." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, their wine glasses forgotten in their hands as they witnessed this final desperate attack. The ceremony was in Stockholm in December 1998, I said calmly, my voice carrying the same measured tone I'd used for thousands of lectures. Lovely winter evening. The King of Sweden presented it personally. Trevor's face flushed crimson above his expensive holiday sweater. You're lying. Prove it. I could feel Emily moving closer through the crowd, her face tight with concern for the spectacle her husband was creating. But I remained focused on Trevor, watching his final plan crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. Carl 15th Gustav, I continued with quiet precision. Quite gracious, actually. We discussed Swedish economic policy briefly during the reception. That's impossible. Trevor's voice cracked slightly, the weight of total defeat finally beginning to sink in. You're just some old professor from a community college. Henry stepped forward with gentle academic authority. Actually, Trevor, Martin taught at Yale University for 35 years. Quite prestigious, I assure you. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the Christmas music seemed to fade into background whispers. Mrs. Henderson touched her husband's arm, a subtle signal about the discomfort of witnessing this family's destruction. Sarah from Morrison was watching the entire scene with fascination, her professional interest in human behavior clearly engaged as she observed her colleague's husband's public breakdown. This can't be happening, Trevor muttered, scrolling frantically through his phone again as if the search results might have magically changed in the past few minutes. I felt a complex mix of triumph and genuine pity for this man, who seemed completely unable to admit he was wrong. 40 years of teaching had shown me many students who struggled with being wrong, but none had ever fought reality with quite this level of desperate denial. The Nobel Foundation website has photos from the ceremony, I mentioned quietly, if you're interested in verification. Trevor's phone slipped slightly in his trembling hands as he stared at me with something close to genuine horror. The look of a man whose entire worldview had just collapsed in front of his Christmas guests. Trevor, that's enough. Emily's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk, sharp with an authority I hadn't heard from her since she was 16, defending her younger cousin from neighborhood bullies. She strode across the living room with determined purpose, her holiday dress swishing as she moved between the scattered guests toward the center of our confrontation. Every eye in the room followed her movement. You're embarrassing yourself and everyone here, she continued, her protective instincts fully engaged, despite the target being her own husband. Trevor spun to face her, his desperation now mixed with betrayal. I won't stand here and listen to this nonsense. This is all some elaborate joke. Stop this immediately. Emily's voice rose to match his volume. You're acting like a child who can't admit he was wrong. The room collectively held its breath. Witnessing a husband and wife fight in public creates a strange discomfort, like watching someone's private diary being read aloud. Fine. Trevor threw his hands up in dramatic defeat. I'm leaving. I won't be humiliated in my own home by some confused old man and fairy tales about prizes. Then go, Emily shot back without hesitation. But stop making this worse for everyone. Trevor stood frozen for a moment, clearly not expecting his wife to call his bluff. The reality of his situation seemed to hit him like cold water. He had nowhere left to go but to physically leave. Mrs. Henderson whispered something to her husband, who nodded gravely. Other guests were beginning to exchange glances that suggested they were thinking about how to leave this family battlefield themselves. Trevor grabbed his coat from the hallway closet with aggressive speed, his movements sharp with wounded pride. His car keys jingled as he fumbled them from the side table. This is ridiculous, he muttered, shrugging into his black wool coat. Absolutely ridiculous. Emily followed him towards the front door, her face a mixture of anger and concern. Despite everything, she was still worried about her husband's emotional state. Trevor, please, she said more quietly. Just drive carefully. He paused at the door, hand on the brass knob, and looked back at the assembled guests who were watching his departure with uncomfortable fascination. Merry Christmas, everyone, he said with bitter sarcasm, then stepped out into the December night. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Through the front window, we could see Trevor's fancy car backing out of the driveway with more speed than winter safety recommended. Emily stood at the window, watching her husband's taillights disappear down Laurelhurst Street, her reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. The room remained frozen in uncomfortable silence, guests unsure whether this marked the end of the evening or if social customs required them to pretend nothing had happened. I moved quietly to Emily's side and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Well," Emily announced to the room after watching Trevor's taillights fade into the winter darkness. "Dinner is still warm, and I worked too hard on that crown roast to let it go to waste." Her voice held forced cheerfulness, but I recognized the strength underneath, the same determination that had gotten her through graduate school while working 2 jobs. The guests exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure whether staying would be appropriate after witnessing such intimate family drama. "Please," Emily continued, turning from the window with a hostess smile that almost hid her emotional turmoil. "I'd really appreciate the company. It's Christmas Eve after all." Henry was the first to respond. "Of course, my dear. It smells absolutely wonderful." The others gradually followed his lead, social momentum carrying them towards the dining room like leaves following a current. People are remarkably resilient when given permission to return to normalcy. As we moved towards dinner, I found myself seated next to Violet Green, Emily's neighbor, whom I'd barely noticed during the earlier chaos. She was an attractive woman in her early 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. "Professor Banks," she said quietly as Emily carved the turkey, "I have to say I'm absolutely fascinated by your career. What an extraordinary evening to learn about your achievements." "Please call me Martin," I replied, grateful for her calm tone after the recent upheaval. "And thank you, though tonight's been rather more dramatic than I typically prefer." Violet laughed softly. "I imagine so, but you handled it with remarkable grace." The dinner conversation gradually found its natural rhythm as wine glasses were refilled, and the traditional Christmas meal worked its magic on frayed nerves. Guests began asking respectful questions about my research, my time at Yale, even the Nobel ceremony itself. "What was Stockholm like in December?" asked Mrs. Henderson, genuinely curious now that the earlier tension had dissipated. "Beautiful," I replied, surprised by how easily the memories flowed. "Snow everywhere, of course. The ceremony itself is quite formal. Tails and white tie, very European tradition." "Did you meet other laureates?" Sarah from Morrison asked, her earlier fascination with family drama now redirected toward intellectual curiosity. As I shared stories from that remarkable week in Sweden, I noticed Violet listening with particular attention, her eyes bright with interest. "Would you perhaps tell me more over coffee sometime?" she asked during a natural pause in the conversation. "I'd love to hear about your research in more detail." The invitation surprised me, though not unpleasantly. "That sounds delightful, Violet. I'd enjoy that very much." Emily, overhearing from across the table, smiled for the first time since Trevor's departure. "I think that's wonderful, Dad." As the evening wound down and guests began their departures, Violet and I exchanged phone numbers with the awkward politeness of teenagers, though we were both well past retirement age. "Thursday afternoon," she suggested. "There's a lovely coffee shop on Hawthorne." "Perfect," I agreed, tucking her number into my jacket pocket. Standing in Emily's doorway as the last guests departed, I reflected on the evening's unexpected turns. I'd arrived expecting awkward family dinner conversation, and instead witnessed the complete vindication of my professional reputation, the collapse of my son-in-law's illusions, and the beginning of what might prove to be an interesting new friendship. "Thank you for tonight," Emily said quietly as we watched Violet's car pull away. "For being you, dignified and kind, even when Trevor was being impossible." "Family is complicated," I replied, putting my arm around my daughter's shoulders, "but truth has a way of emerging eventually." As I drove home through Portland's holiday-lit streets, I realized this Christmas Eve had given me something I hadn't expected. A reminder that even at 68, new chapters were still possible. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.